Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. We're thrilled to be here with you. I'm Sarah Gerke, your moderator for today's panel on Women in 3D, Disrupting the Status Quo. I've been a journalist dedicated to the 3D printing industry since 2014, and now I operate Additive Integrity, an AM-focused editorial services company through which I work with Fabaloo and other clients in media and the industry. I'm also on the board of directors of Women in 3D Printing, which now has more than 10,000 members worldwide. Through Women in 3D Printing, I have been leading our diversity for additive manufacturing reports since their introduction in 2018. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's panel discussion and to invite you also to participate. We're really glad to have you with us. 3D printing is not only a new technology, but it's representative of a change in mindset, changing the way we design and produce. As this transformative technology grows, so does the need to challenge the historical gender gap present in today's high technology positions. We have with us today an expert group of speakers gathered to shine a light on the role of women in 3D printing and to inspire us all to become part of the change in this maturing industry. We have a couple of housekeeping things before we start. First of all, please feel free to type any questions in the chat window that you have on the right-hand side of your screen, and we will do our best to address and cover all of your questions. Second, during the session, you can browse through our supplemental content on the upper right-hand side of the screen to learn more about today's panelists and topic. Speaking of our panelists, the brilliant women we have joining us today are Heather Baker, the VP of People at Fast Radius; Sarah Bover, founder of Fab Lab Hub and author of New Collar Workforce; Jill Christner, President and General Manager of SLM Solutions for the Americas; and Sunita Lanto, Global Head of Marketing / CMO for HP's 3D printing and digital manufacturing business. Today, we're here to chat with Sunita, Jill, Sarah, and Heather about the status quo in the 3D printing industry in terms of gender parity. This has been a long-running conversation in essentially every workforce, especially in the manufacturing industry, where men do make up a substantial majority of workers from the C-suite to the factory floor. We think that advanced manufacturing technologies can see advances in that employment status quo. Our focus today is not only on why we do need to keep having this conversation, but on actionable takeaways. And again, we do want all of you with us today to be part of this conversation. Please do submit your questions at any time through the chat window. We will have a dedicated Q&A time at the end of the session to directly address the issues that you most want to know more about. And to further your participation, we'd like to start the session with a quick poll for everyone joining us. You should see it popping up on your screen now. We want to know if you have felt that your career experience has been substantially different from your colleagues' experiences of another gender. The options are yes, no, or I've never thought about it. Okay, we are seeing those votes come in, and we're very thankful to have you contributing your thoughts. So it looks like after this quick vote, we're at 77% of you think that yes, your experiences have been different from those of another gender. And about 22% of you have never actually thought about it. No one is saying no, though. So now that we've taken a quick overview about your perceptions of this imbalance, let's get to it. We've got these experts, so let's see what they know. Well, as we start the conversation, let's start with a simple point. Why are we having it? Why is it worth talking about diversity in the workplace in 3D printing? Jill, I'd love to start with your perspective on why we want women at the table.
Thanks, Sarah. Happy to be here today and super excited about, and want to say thank you to the HP team that's putting it on. So why do we have the conversation? Why are we here? I think first and foremost, when you bring different perspectives to the table, women have a different perspective. We think about things different. We approach problems different. And when you have that diversity at the table, it enables you to have a different conversation, to approach it differently, and to have different outcomes, which is in the end what we really want.
Fantastic. Sunita, when we've spoken before, you've pointed to studies that have been published that have shown that diversity improves the bottom line of a business. Can you walk us through what that means and what this research suggests in terms of personnel makeup?
Yeah, great question, Sarah. And first of all, thanks for having me here. Very happy to be able to share some perspectives. So actually here at HP, we have been looking at some studies because we feel, to put a number around, certain aspects or topics that we think are important is actually important. And so, for example, I read a recent study by the Boston Consulting Group. They found that diversity actually increased revenues by 19%. And so in this particular study, they look at 1,700 different companies across 8 different countries from various industries and company sizes. And the question then that comes to mind is like, what is really driving this kind of like increase in revenues, from a diversity perspective? And it turns out it's all about innovation. And of course, this finding is huge for tech companies, for 3D printing industries, any industries that innovation is the key to growth. Because it shows that when you think about diversity, as Jill already mentioned, it's not just about age, gender, or race, but by having more diverse people, you actually have diversity of minds, ideas, and approaches. And when you have a problem, then different people look at the problem differently from different angles, and you can come to a stronger solution. And when I think about it as well, I think as companies become more global and interconnected, I think our employee base and also our customer base are also very diverse. And so as companies add more diversity, both in their teams and in their leadership management teams, then they can be more representative of both their employee base and also their customer base. And one last thing, Sarah, I want to share is I also saw a Deloitte study that said that about 35% of millennials said that they have actually left the job to go to another company that is more inclusive. And so from that perspective, I think having a diverse management team and team also help with retention and hiring the best and the brightest.
I think that's a great point, Sunita, and it's incredible that studies are really showing this quantitatively as well. I had a conversation just this week with a young woman who was interested in joining a company, but the gender makeup was giving her second thoughts. So she reached out to see if I thought it might be a decent workplace for her, or if she thought she would just be joining a boys club. And so it's definitely top of mind for a lot of the workforce. And speaking of that workforce, Heather, heading up the people operations must have given you quite an interesting perspective on the workforce makeup. Can you explain to us a little bit about your experience and how open have your coworkers and employees been on the subject of gender equity?
Yeah, that's a great question. I just want to first say thank you, really incredible group of women to be on this panel. So excited to be here. And I will also underscore what Sunita just shared, that is so important on the diversity side. In fact, one of our investors just released a diversity report that their top 4 portfolio companies were all diverse companies, including 40% women, 20% at the board level, and then also people of color. So I think it just underscores what Sunita just said, even with growth stage companies, how important that is and start early. In terms of my experience in being head of people, it's a unique position to be in because I get to see all parts of the business. And I've been in 2 industries, tech and manufacturing, where women have been underrepresented historically, and also been on leadership teams where I've been the only female. And how that shows up for me is also on a personal level, making sure that I am the voice of women at the table and representing other smaller underrepresented groups there, and making sure that's part of the conversation. And then from a company level, it has been definitely receptive from our team, but what I found is creating awareness. When you have a group of people, primarily who are just men, they might not be thinking about how this shows up, like pay inequality and how women might interview differently and the needs that they might have. They don't understand it, it's not a conversation and they're not aware of it. So we need to bring that to the forefront and create that as a conversation so that women can be represented. The other part of this that I would say too is that as we grow as a company, we're only 3 years old, we add more women into leadership roles, but there's a lot of pressure on the senior leadership roles to represent the women in the organization in terms of how other women look up to them, making sure that they are the best in class. And so there's a tremendous amount of pressure to kind of be the one or two single females at the leadership level. And so how do we support them so that they don't have to feel that way? And then it's more of just about strong leadership and that women know a path forward. So I obviously have a lot to say on that, but it is definitely one of a passion area for me.
No, that sounds like a really valid point. I think we've all spoken about it. You know, in this group we have today, we've all had the experience of being the only woman at a table, whether it's at a conference, at a meeting, or even, you know, a decision-making table, an interviewing table. I'd like to open this particular topic up a little bit to our other panelists as well and turn to Jill. Do you see that this is a conversation that's really happening in your experience?
I do, Sarah. And one of the things that Heather touched on when she said, we may interview different, or we may show up different, or we may shy away from that role that we really, maybe it's a stretch role, but we can get there. And I think that's one of the pieces that we have to have the conversation around and say, okay, can I take a bet, right? You don't win every bet, but to make a bet and invest in reaching out and saying, hey, I think you'd be a great fit for this role. Why don't you, at least apply? Let's have the conversation around it and let's talk about the gaps. How do we make a path to get you there? I think that's some of the things that we would shy away from. And I know, Sunita talked about studies. There's studies all over the place that women need to check the box for every one that we're qualified for before we take the jump. And men don't necessarily, some do, but not necessarily always have to check all those boxes and say, hey, I'm good to go. I'm going to go for this role. And so it's really reaching out and being proactive to go pull them in and say, hey, we can get you there. Let us help you build your career to get there. And so we've had a lot of those discussions, specifically at SLM. We're super excited. We've added our first female board member. So big leap for us. So, but yeah, I think you have to keep having that conversation. Otherwise, this subconscious bias is just kind of creep in. There's been a lot of conversation around that as well, but for sure, it's something we have to proactively have the discussions around.
Absolutely, and those are great points, and congratulations to SLM for broadening the board. That's wonderful news. And talking about broadening that discussion, when we're talking about who's even having the conversation, Sunita, in your experience, have you seen men having this conversation as well?
Yeah, interestingly, I would say when I look back at my, roughly 20-year career, there definitely have been some male leaders that, I have met along my journey that they actually take gender equity seriously, and I think some of them even took it a step further, and they act as these allies and champions, to ensure gender equity. And about a few months ago, I actually got on another panel that talked about allyship. And that was the first time I would say that, I understood, even though I've met all these male that was acting as allies and champions, that was the first time I kind of like formalize, the definition of allyship. And so basically, based on this panel, what, the experts in diversity and inclusion told me, allies are basically members of an advantage group that are actually committed to reaching out, building meaningful relationship with the disadvantaged group, and in this case could be women, and expressing as little sexism in their own behavior as possible. And they understand the social privilege conferred by their gender, and they demonstrate active efforts to address gender inequities both at work and also in society. And some of these men actually act as real catalysts for change. And actually, my previous boss at the HP, the person who hired me, he's no longer here, but he actually put in kind of like a few, I would say, goals and metrics that were real from a hiring perspective, from supplier diversity perspective. He was requiring, some of our suppliers to reach a certain level of diversity. So there are definitely, I would say, these male allies out there that really take the gender equity topic seriously.
Which is wonderful. When we're talking about growth like this, it really does take the entire community to see it grow and to welcome new members. And that includes a lot of help from allies. Mm-hmm. And when we're talking about that kind of growth, there's often an implicit bias, an unconscious bias that we don't like to really talk about, but we do all have it from our own experiences. And Sarah, when we've talked before, you've mentioned some of your experiences that center around that type of unconscious bias. And you've also been working with these technologies a little longer than the rest of us here today. How have you found your experiences as a woman working with lasers and advanced technologies has differed from that of your male colleagues?
Well, I think that is, and actually use it to your advantage. And so my first conference, the conference on lasers and electro-optics in 1986. There were 10,000 men and 5 women. And it allowed me to be really visible. And it allowed me to be able to get to meet people. I mean, everyone wanted to talk to me. I was the only girl. I was 30 years old, and I, was tall and thin and came from the music industry. So I didn't dress in khaki pants and a blue shirt, and I stood out, and I really used that to my advantage over the years. It was disconcerting on the unconscious bias side because on the phone, people would assume when I answered the sales line, we were only 5 people in our startup. They would assume I was the receptionist, and you'd say, oh, well, tell me what your question is. And even if it was something off the spreadsheet, they insisted they had to talk to a PhD. And I had apprenticed for 2 years with my business partner in the lab. So I really understood our product and had extremely intimate knowledge of how it worked in every application. And so once I could answer their questions, I could do most equations in my head. I got enormous respect, but I think the visibility was really central to my success in my overall career, but also to our company. And our company was very visible for a company as small as we were at the beginning.
And that's such an interesting point you make too about the visibility of a small company, of being a woman, one of 5 women at a 10,000 person event. That's something. That is definitely something. I know in the past I've been to CES, and I've enjoyed it in part because it's one of the only large events I've been to where there was never a line for the ladies' room. And so that's quite different from going to the theater or going to any other event in years other than 2020, when there's a line for the men's room and not the ladies. Definitely just shows a little bit of the difference of makeup at these events, and it's easy to be noticed when you're the woman there. And Sunita, that also mirrors an experience you had while you were at MIT. What's something interesting you found during your time at MIT that your male counterparts might not have noticed?
Sorry, I just muted myself. Okay, yeah, that's an interesting question, Sarah, because like what I found throughout my experience, I think at times people or institutions, they don't necessarily mean to be discriminatory, like blatantly or consciously, but there are just certain historical situations that make it so. as you mentioned, I went to MIT for my graduate school, and during my time there, women actually comprise already about 50% of the student population. And granted, the campus is pretty urban, so there are many buildings. However, historically, given that it was primarily, an engineering and science school, it had been a place that historically had been predominantly male. And interestingly, this was actually reflected in the fact that one of the oldest, like the older main historical buildings, they only had, they had male bathrooms on every floor, but female bathrooms only on every other floor. And what was interesting was actually during the summer of my graduation, I think the school, decided finally that, hey, we're going to change this, especially in that historical building that everyone see with the MIT dome, that we actually had to construct, like female bathrooms on every floor in order to kind of like reflect, the makeup of the school at the time, which was already 50-50 male, female. And so just from this kind of simple example, I think you can see that in this modern age, I don't think people and institutions consciously want to be biased, but there are just certain historical remnants of the old days that need to be modernized in order to reflect, the diverse society that we actually live in today.
Absolutely, and that's such a great point. And it's obviously we don't want to hang around the topic of bathrooms too long. That's not really what we're here for today. But I know writing a previous edition of the Diversity for AM study for women in 3D printing, I centered the report around the movie Hidden Figures. And one of the main scenes of the movie is when one of the scientists is unable to use a restroom in the building where she works every day and has to run all the way across campus and run back. And eventually they noticed that's taking a lot of time out of her day. And she said, there are no colored bathrooms here. And so it took an ally, and some saw that scene as a little of a white savior moment, but it did take an ally to just rip down the sign that forbade her from using that bathroom. And so opening up something as small as restrooms really shows how things evolve on every front when it comes to these terms of equity that we're talking about. So we really are seeing some tide shift from visible things like bathrooms to makeups of boardrooms. And there's so many more women today entering the workforce in STEM, engineering, all of these different areas that have been male dominated, especially in manufacturing, including additive manufacturing. As study changes, so does the shape of the workforce. And I think, again, all of us here today on this panel have had the experience of being the only woman in a room. That's changing, and it's wonderful. It's been a while now since I can think of an event where I was the only woman at a room or in a table at a tech event. So I'd like to call on our audience today, everyone joining us today, for another poll so we can kind of see what you think the shape of the industry is right now. And so we'll throw this other poll up here right now. And we'd like to ask you approximately what percentage you think the additive manufacturing workforce is comprised of women today. So we'd like to ask you to respond to that poll. It's just kind of a temperature taker to see how many women you think are in the AM workforce today. Our options are 5%, 15%, 25%, 35%, or 50%. And we'd just love to kind of take the temperature, see where you think we are today, and get your responses into the poll. I can see you all responding, and that's great. We'll give it just a second to get your answers in. Okay, it's looking like the most popular votes are, giving it just another second here. Most people are voting for about 25% of the industry. We've got 20% voting for 5%, but the most popular definitely is 25%. And according to an annual salary survey from Alexander Daniels Global from 2017 to 2019, in all three of those reports, the percentage of women in the 3D printing workforce was between 11 and 13%. So 15% is the closest of these responses, but it's also overshooting it. And that's just another figure that kind of feeds into why we're having this chat today. So what can we actually do to develop an industry that's more diverse, more inclusive? Let's talk action items and actually changing that status quo. Heather, you've talked about Fast Radius recently implementing DEI training. Can you tell us why that decision was made and what your team's been getting out of it?
Yeah, so we started into this year, hopefully, am I coming through okay? I got some feedback, hopefully you can hear me okay. We started this year as organizational health is a real important strategy for us as a company as we grow. And then COVID came and that became even more important. So part of that organizational health is around diversity for all the reasons that most of the people on this panel, including Sunita, which she opened up with, which is diversity of thought brings higher performance within the company. It brings innovation, and partly because you have people bringing diversity of thought and healthy debate because there's a psychological safety that's created for a good DEI program to bring that diversity of thought. So that is partly what spurred us. But to do it, it is not something that you just sort of check the box. It is for the long haul. So we set it out to create with a partner. So we use an outside organization, and then we first surveyed our staff because we wanted to better understand what is the readiness of our staff for diversity inclusion. So it's not just about hiring, but it's also about what we do when we bring diverse groups of people into the organization and we create an environment that will keep them here. So that survey allowed us to better understand where we stood as a company and what our teams thought about our diversity within the organization. And so we did that over the summer. That was a long haul, and then took that data and figure out what do we need to do as a company? What is the 30, 60, 90-day plan and into next year for sure. So it revolved around 4 things, and we call it the R2P2 model, which is recruiting, retention, promotion, and protection. So those are the 4 buckets that we looked at. So recruiting is an obvious one. And for us, we needed to make sure that we were representing both women, because right now we're at 20%, which is better than the number you just shared, but I am not happy with that. I want it to be more. There's more out there. So what are we doing from a recruiting perspective to attract more talent? And that starts with not just going actively recruiting the talent, but also partnering with organizations outside of our own. Such as Women in 3D Printing, as well as other organizations that are communities we serve that service diverse organizations. So that's one area. And then on the other side, and I could talk forever on this, but I will talk more just on the protection and promotion, which is making sure, especially as a growing company, when you're a startup, we don't have everything in place, but creating career levels is really important. And that's something that we're tackling in this Q1 coming up, so that people at all levels, and women and people of color, diverse groups of people, know exactly where they stand and how they get to the next level. That's really important, and for creating equity. And then also accessibility to information. Some people might not necessarily feel comfortable reaching out to their manager, but want to have that information accessible somewhere. So we are not perfect, right? But we are making strides, and it's something that we constantly do. We just did like bias training for interviewing, how that shows up, what that looks like. How do we formalize our interview structure so that it's a very clear and unified way to interview people, and giving feedback is clear and unified. So there's a lot of things you can do, but it's really important that you understand your organization, then also teach them what that means. That was the other thing we did, was training. What does diversity, equity, inclusion mean? What does it mean to your organization? But then also, how does that show up in power structures? How does that show up in everyday performance evaluations, et cetera? So it's about creating the dialogue and continuing to create that dialogue, because if you don't, it's something that just sort of fades off. It takes work, it takes time, and you've got to get the investment of your leadership team in, and then the rest of your team. That's the most important part, start at the top, so that they are leading you through the progress. So that is that is some of the things that we've been doing. There's a lot more I could say, but hopefully it gives people a perspective of how to get started, because it can be overwhelming, and an initiative that people think, okay, I should do it, but where do I start? Really start with surveying and understanding their staff.
Which is so important. You raised some really great points there, Heather, especially with having that support start from the top. For an organization to make progress like that, you really do need that full level support starting at the top. So speaking of, let's turn to Jill and see how you've been working at SLM Solutions to get away from previous norms of decision making.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. So first of all, Heather, I love what you just said. That's why I love these panels. We can learn so much from the people that you've engaged. That was amazing. So I think what are we doing at SLM? You know, one of the things that shocked me when I came into the additive industry, and I'm not, it'll be 3 years next year, but it's so tight. And I was an outsider, and we're looking at the industry and how do we grow the industry? Well, the industry is not going to grow if people don't feel like they can get into it and break that, I don't even know what you call it, that tight knit, you don't know what you're talking about. We're the experts over here, so just stay in your box over here. So I think one thing is, you know, that we've been actively doing is how do we bring people into the industry, even at the university level, right? So there's no schools of additive, if you will, right? We're beginning to see them. Purdue has a great program. Penn State's starting to talk about it. UTEP starting. So you start to see some of the universities having programs, but as we go around and even talk to how do we get people coming out of school such that we can grow this industry, it's in the mechanical engineering department. Or, you know, now we're starting to see a few of them figure out that, hey, maybe it fits better in the materials department. And so it's one of those things where how do we actively engage it? Because we can't grow if we don't have the resources to grow the industry and bring people in from external. They can learn it, right? We can't keep this little tight-knit little industry and expect to grow. We've got to be able to get that out, bring in the talent that can learn all the different technologies, you know, whether it's plastics or metals or what have you. So it's very enlightening because you see, I love additive, especially where I'm at, because every day you work in a different industry, right? So we work in medical one day and aerospace the next day and you automotive the next. I mean, it's so broad that, you know, any conversation you have, you're learning from your customer, you're learning from your employees, you're learning from the industry. So anyway, it's a lot of fun. And so come on in.
Which is such a great point. This technology is so agile, especially because for additive manufacturing, you don't need tooling and all of the things that tend to make traditional manufacturing take so long and cost so much. And so for such an agile manufacturing technology, we need that agile workforce. Mm-hmm. And when we're talking about that new workforce, we're talking about that new collar workforce. And we do happen to have Sarah here who knows so much about the new collar workforce. She's literally written the book about it. So Sarah, I'd love it if you could talk a little bit about just some of those agile skills that Jill was talking about and how people might, you know, step up into this tight-knit, wonderful industry.
Exactly. And I mean, you're just right on, Jill. And I would like to take credit for the new color terminology, but it actually is a term that Ginny Rometty, the CEO of IBM, uses to describe how blue collar jobs have become digital and there are now new collar jobs. And I think that just embodies what it's all about. And all jobs now are digital and it's across industries. It's not just in manufacturing. And what we have done at Fab Lab Hub is I worked extensively with Jennifer Odo, who at the time was at IBM and is now at Youngstown State in running their apprenticeship program. And we developed because when I did all of this research about the skills that were needed in the industry, and I spoke with 200 manufacturers, again, that being visible as a woman came in handy because I could contact any CEO and they knew me. And I interviewed 200 companies about what are the skills you need for operators and technicians. And what I realized at the end was that I wasn't going to write a 2 or 4 year curriculum, that people needed workers today, and they needed to be skill specific, and they needed to be problem solvers. And I thought that's what we do in Fab Labs. And so working with Jennifer and Youngstown State, we developed and had, fortunately, with the help of IBM, a registered apprenticeship for an additive manufacturing technician approved by the US Department of Labor. And a registered apprenticeship is really rigorous. It incorporates on-the-job training with formal education through our digital badges in our case. And the thing that I've done is that, I could wait for women to come into the industry, but I thought that's not, we need to be proactive. And so here in New Mexico, which is a very rural state with a very large Latino population and a large Native American population, we have 4 apprenticeships in this program starting, and we're going to have 50% of them. So it's only 2, but it's a start. And we've reached out through the Santa Fe Indian School to women high school graduates on the reservations to help bring in women to our program, and working with the New Mexico Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. And we have to reach out to women. We really can't just wait for them to show up. We have to do more in STEM. And I find our digital badge classes here in Santa Fe, it's because it's short, it's affordable, you can try it. And if you hate it, you don't have to do it. You're out a couple $100 in 6 weeks. But if you don't know what it's about, it's a great way to get your feet wet and to come in and then build your skills based on that. And I think we have to get out into the world more. We have to reach those kids at about the middle school level. And the last thing I'll say is, because you're right, I have written the book on this, so I could talk about this like Heather for a long time. But we have a new grant contract with America Makes, and we're taking my additive badges for FDM, and we are breaking them down into their component parts for middle schoolers. And, it's not too early to start. And I'm really excited about that project in particular, because I think when we catch girls when they're younger, and give them those skills. I mean, I had, the reason I was successful was also that I had great math skills. And I think when we give girls those skills, you can't take that away from any woman. You can't take away that you can do differential equations. And we have to reach those women when they're young.
That's such a great point. Accessibility is so critical to fostering the next generation of any part of the workforce. And so especially when we're talking about something so specialized as additive manufacturing, we really need to ensure that we reach those young minds who might be the ones who come up with the next steps that really take us to the next levels. And so when we're talking about doing that, a lot of it comes to how we're reaching them and the language we're using. So Sunita, that kind of falls right into your wheelhouse. How have you seen messaging changing to become more inclusive? What can we do to see messaging meet reality and move toward a more equitable future?
Yeah, great question, Sarah. And as I was listening to Heather, to Jill, to Sarah B, I think I want to address this from both the supply role model and demand perspective. So what Sarah B just mentioned with regard to reaching out to girls when they're young, I think like just from our families, right? Like parents, the community, teachers, I think we all need to encourage girls to study more math and science. Not too long ago, I saw some interesting statistics. The Society of Women Engineers said that in grade school, about 60% of boys said math and science is their favorite subject, but only 40% of girls, you know. And then when you go to the college and you look at the top 5 states that graduate the most women in STEM, only about 20% of the graduates are women. So I think like from the supply side, we need to, you know, all of us just encourage girls from a very young age to study math and science, and, you know, for them to see that it's cool. It's not just for the boys. And then in addition to that, it just crossed my mind. I think women also need role models, those who are good in math and science, but not only at the aspirational level. I think we all need aspirational level, like the C level, the Nobel Prize, you know, winners and all that, but also on the practical level, women who are good at what they do, who are just 1 or 2 steps ahead of us in their career, you know. So women in college, you know, see young professionals who are good, you know, in their field, who are women who are just starting out in an industry could see middle manager that are good. So I think like it's important for girls to have good role models, both at the aspirational but also at the practical level. And then from the company perspective, you know, I think what really resonated, and all of you guys have said it, it had to come from the top, and it has to be systemic, you know. And what I meant by that, it cannot just be this fringe program, feel good program, lip service, but, you know, the company really has to put it into kind of the fabrics of who the company is as a company. And, you know, I would say at HP, and this is actually one of the things that really struck me when I first came here, you know, the company take it very seriously. Our board is 55% minorities. You know, we're a large company, $60 billion, to have, you know, 55% of the board minorities, 40% women, 30% underrepresented minorities. That really sends home kind of like a message, right? And then we also have real programs, real goals, real metrics. And when I look, actually before this panel, I checked on our hiring statistics. I think, you know, our workforce, about 30% women, and about 35% of those women are in senior executive positions. And just last year, I think 55% of our hires in the United States are actually underrepresented minorities. So my point is, I think from the, we have to address it from the supply side, from the role model side, and also from the demand side. Companies just have to be much more systemic and, I guess, authentic in taking diversity and inclusion seriously.
That's such a fantastic point. And it is so important to see companies like HP who do walk that walk, not just talk the talk. I know that I've been to several of HP's 3D printing facilities throughout the world, from Barcelona to Palo Alto, Corvallis, and at everyone I've seen women working in the labs, women, you know, handling the powders, handling the designs, and leading projects. And I've spoken to several amazing women from HP this year who have led projects helping to, you know, utilize your technologies to fight the pandemic. And so seeing all of that is really wonderful. And especially your point about how representation matters at every level. I think that's so important, because we don't just need, we need more female CEOs. Let's not pretend we don't, but we need more women through every level, because there are only so many CEOs. But there are thousands of engineers, millions of engineers. And so we need to see that just become more common. A phrase that I've heard recently that stuck with me is that diversity is getting invited to the party while inclusion is being asked to dance.
Oh.
And so, especially you're talking those statistics and the retention that Jill and Heather and Sarah, you've all mentioned as well, being able to really retain that and foster that from the top down and to work it throughout the whole company is just critical. And as it works through more companies, it works through the industry as a whole. And I think that's a better future for additive manufacturing, to get those amazing goals that we've seen that are possible from diversity of thought, which is brought about by diversity of the workforce. And so there's definitely a lot to unpack here, a lot to discuss here. And I think with the passion and the experience of the panel with us today, we could easily keep going for a few hours, especially with all of the experiences that all of these women have brought to us. But I also want to make sure we include everyone joining us live today. And we've had some questions come in from our audience. So we're going to turn now to our dedicated time for Q&A. And so I'm checking out a couple of the questions we've had in. The first one that came in, I actually don't have a direct answer for, but I do have a resource to point you toward. We had a question about stats on how many women hold management roles in additive manufacturing compared to general stats surrounding workforce. And Sunita did just lay out some of the statistics for HP. Industry-wide, they are a little bit harder to come by. They're underreported, which is something I've been trying to work with a lot of companies on, and we're finding that out. But I would point you to the study I cited earlier from Alexander Daniels Global. They do an annual survey report, a salary survey rather. And I think you might be able to find a little bit more of the breakdowns there. I do know offhand that the highest representation of women in AM is in marketing and other communications-based roles, such as writing. So it isn't so much in directly engineering or science, but that is where the highest concentrations are. But again, I'm not going to name direct figures, and unless anyone here has those figures offhand, I think we'll sit with that being a resource point and move on to our next question. We've got another question from the audience. How do we mentor young adults, especially young women, effectively to gain the skills they need to be successful in these skills? I know, Sarah, you had started to address some of that. Would you like to start this one?
Sure. A lot of our work is based on the problem sets at MIT because we come out of MIT, and a lot of our work is in Fab Labs is project-based learning. And I think when we get people to actually put their hands on a machine and design something and hold in their hand at the end an idea that they had, it just becomes real. And it's not reading about it in a book or just doing something that is theoretical. And we do all project-based learning based upon real problems. And so I cringe when I hear the schools talk about the famous birdhouse project they do, where all the kids have to modify a birdhouse for their favorite bird. And I think, well, that's okay if you're a kid that likes birds, but if you're a kid that doesn't like birds, you know, how's this going to work? And what we do, and I did this in Boston in the inner city when I was living in Cambridge, and we took the kids from an inner city school. We went to a grocery store, and we went through the grocery store and had them look at problems and what were the things in there, and it was their local grocery store that they and their family shopped in. And my favorite solution was one kid noticed that the carts were running into, the old people were looking down and they were running their carts into the heels of the other shoppers. And so this little boy who was in 7th grade had this idea that a little black boy, that if he put a sensor on the front of the cart, like a distance sensor, he could stop this problem. And he 3D printed the holder for the sensor. We had to buy the sensor. And then it came back to a brake that he put on the wheels. And when the sensor determined that the old people were running into their fellow shoppers, it would just stop the carts. And that was a middle school kid in inner city Boston. And Sunita, you will know this, it was in Roxbury. You know, I think those are the kinds of experiences we have to have. We have to have hands-on project-based learning.
That's such a great experience. So that's a great response for mentorship, really having that access and that understanding to build these skills across various populations that might not historically have had access to this information. And so building that kind of relationship in different neighborhoods, to different audiences, to different youth is just critical. So we've had another question come in from the audience where we're turning back to specifically women in the workplace. Do you think women are at greater risk of developing imposter syndrome? How do you overcome those negative thoughts, especially as it relates to being a woman and earning your seat at the table? Heather, I think you might have a really great perspective on this if you'd like to kick off this question.
Yeah, I think, so I think the question is there a greater risk that they have imposter syndrome that women do? Is that the question? Yes, for sure. And I think women, this is broad strokes, so I think this is not all women, but some of the younger workforce that I've worked with is that there's this fear that they don't deserve it, or that they're not good enough, or that they're not going to do well when they are probably the smartest people in the room at that time. And so it's important that women have those mentors, when we go back to that mentorship, and see other people in the room, because that gives them encouragement to do that. That's one way we're going to get there. That shouldn't be the only way, but I think that's one way that we start. But absolutely, I see it all the time. I'm coaching young women, not just in my own team here at Fast Radius, but outside the organization, about taking that step. And doesn't mean, just because you haven't done it, doesn't mean that you are not good at it. It doesn't not mean that you are not going to be successful. And I think traditionally, I've seen young men gravitate to things that they've never done before and just excel and do well because they have all this confidence. And some women come at it with some lack of confidence, and that impacts how they show up, when in reality they're really good at what they do, but because they have the lack of confidence, they don't show up the way they could. So for all those women that are on this call right now, I wish I could see all of you, that I just empower you that everyone has that doubt. I have that doubt. I'm sure all of these women on this panel at some point in their career has had doubts at some point or time, but you just powering through that and knowing that you are smart and you are successful, you will show up in a powerful way, and then people will follow you, and then you'll encourage other people to do the same. So I just want to underscore that, because I think it's super important that women don't necessarily always hear that and know that they are not alone.
That's such an important message, Heather, and wonderfully delivered. I think it's such an important thing to keep in mind, especially because imposter syndrome is a very real thing. I'm not going to speak for any of the rest of you. I know I've struggled with it. But the wonderful thing about a technology like 3D printing and the work that's happening now in digital manufacturing is really that this is work that hasn't been done before either. So it doesn't, thinking that you can't do it because you've never done it before, you know what, no one has. So why not start with you?
Heather, I do want to just share a story. It's not my own experience, but one of my colleagues, when I was, just starting out, we were having this kind of leadership talk, and we were talking about imposter syndrome. And she used to be in the news organization, I guess. And, one time she was interning at, one of the big news stations in New York City. And I guess like the interns had an opportunity to meet with Diane Sawyer. And so everyone went into this room, and apparently she said there is this one chair that was Diane's chair, and no one sat there. And then in came this like a male young intern. He just came in late. He sat there and no one said anything. But she was using that example to show that like all the female interns, they were very conscientious. They didn't sit there. And then the male intern just came in and sat there. And actually when Diane Sawyer came in, she didn't ask him to move, but it just show how, as you said, Heather, sometimes men, they don't think too much, they just like do it, and it could be an advantage and a disadvantage. And I think for women, we want to be prepared, double prepared, extra prepared before we do anything. And so I think there is a balance between confidence and arrogance and just being comfortable knowing who you are and where you are in your career journey.
I think we even talked about this panel in itself, Jill. I think we were talking about that in terms of showing up on panels and what is it like for women on panels, and confidence in showing up. So I think it's even a topic we discussed in this panel alone. So as you grow up in your career, and I'm not speaking for everyone else on this panel, but I've been in the workforce for 25 plus years, and it still shows up for me, right? Every time. And there's new scenarios where you're still showing up and having the confidence to bring to the table and say, yes, I deserve this, or yes, I am capable of doing these things that are in front of me. It takes work, but you will get there.
Yeah, I was at a customer and we were doing introductions and I was the last one to go, and I introduced myself and he said to me, well, wow, how'd you get that job? You would never, like, and you have to, as a customer, pull it together. But what's going through your head is, I'm qualified and I'm good at, why not? And but and I don't remember how I phrased it because I was fairly irritated, but you have to think, I mean, there's feedback that comes in like that, and there will be challenged. You will get feedback that says, hey, what about this? What about this? What about this? And you begin to think, maybe I'm not qualified. Maybe I'm not good enough. Maybe I shouldn't be here. Maybe, this person could do it better, or that person could do it better. You're in the role because someone knew you could do it and someone took a bet on you. And so come to the table, bring everything you've got, and you let the thought come, process it, vet the feedback, and then move on.
I think that is just a beautiful way to say that, Jill. And I think, just watching you do what you do, you've clearly earned your position. I don't know why anyone would ask that. It's been a great honor to have you here today and to have all of you amazing, qualified, brilliant women working to advance the future of advanced manufacturing and to help create this better workforce for us all, this better environment for us all, which will lead to a better industry, better technology, and better results for us all. It's been my pleasure to join here to sit alongside all of you all virtually. And I'd love to thank you all so much for being here with us today. Thank you for having me be a part of this conversation as well. I really appreciate it. And thank you so much to everyone who's joined us live today and for everyone who's joining us after the fact. This session will be available recorded on demand very soon. And we're so grateful for everyone for being here. And we hope that conversations like this continue, and we all look forward to being part of them. Again, I'd like to direct you to the supplemental resources available on the right side of your screen to learn more about any of our speakers today. And we all look forward to building a better tomorrow in 3D printing, a more equitable future with a more balanced workforce. So thank you again for joining us. It's been wonderful to be here today. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.